Welcome to How to Choose a Probiotic Part 2. In Part 1, we looked at the key criteria in making a probiotic selection overall, as well as the kind of general kind of overview of our microbiome and looking at the 4 core strains that we find through the HMF line. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to look at a few specialty strains that have unique properties to them, as well as looking at some of the nice combination strains that we find in the HMF line that pair these clinically proven strains of bacteria with other unique ingredients, be it nutrients or botanicals, to really deliver a synergistic formula for various conditions. As I mentioned in part 1, I am an employee of Atrium. I have no other conflicts of interest to disclose, and as always, this is strictly for educational purposes and intended for licensed healthcare practitioners. Before we launch into the new content, we're going to do a very brief overview of some of the key concepts from part 1, looking and reminding ourselves, namely, when do we want to be most thinking about utilizing a probiotic? What are those 3 criteria most important when we choose a probiotic for an individual? Just again, the colonization patterns we want to be keeping top of mind and what that means for our probiotic selection. And finally, reminding ourselves of those 4 core strains throughout the HMF line that we spoke about and the major areas where the clinical studies have been shown for them to demonstrate really clear beneficial effects with our physiology. So what are some of the key indications for when a probiotic is needed? So one of the biggest ones, and we spoke a lot about this in part 1, is alongside antibiotic use. There's other medications that we know have a major impact on the microbiome: oral contraceptives, hormone replacement therapy, proton pump inhibitors, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. These are some main ones. So if an individual is using any of these medications, definitely we know the microbiome's taking a hit. Obviously, stress was something we talked about. Any kind of stress, as well as immune activity, any kind of cytokine imbalance, a kind of a pro-inflammatory ongoing picture, all of those things are going to hit our microbiome, as is just exposure to environmental toxins or pesticides in our food. So there's a lot of day-to-day elements, as well as, some kind of key symptom pictures that really indicate it. So obviously, probably top of mind for most people when they think of probiotics is digestive system, and that is absolutely the case. So if we're seeing bloating, constipation, diarrhea, with pregnancy, we're going to talk a lot about this today. There's a really unique window. So it's particularly important to optimize mom's microbiome in the kind of pre and postnatal elements. And again, I do really emphasize a probiotic from my clinical perspective as being, a key foundational part of healthy living, right up there with healthy eating and clean water consumption. The reason being is because we know our microbiome really influences how our body digests and assimilates nutrients. So I often recommend a probiotic as being, a first line supplement even before a multivitamin, because it's really going to help the individual get the most out of their diet. Other thing to really think about, and I think this is where we get into some of the fascinating implications in the research, is we know that the microflora in our gut can really, influence our food choices from a standpoint of, affecting cravings as well as even the caloric intake. So, up here we talk about our microbiome, changes and influences how we digest and assimilate. That even goes with respect to, the caloric intake of food, where 2 individuals could eat the exact same meal, the exact same amount in portions, and, break it down and have a different metabolic value from a calorie perspective. So really vast, kind of reaching effects with our microbiome. And especially, as we look to an increasing trend in society these days, we're seeing a huge rise of stress-related complaints and mental health and mood issues. And we know now clearly that our microbiota, particularly the microbiota in the small intestine, the duodenal region right after the stomach, that gut-brain axis hotspot that we talked so much about in part one is really important for producing neurotransmitters. And so again, when, one of the reasons that I so emphasize a human strain probiotic as being foundational is because of all these elements it touches. It's not just how it's influencing our nutrient assimilation, but also production of key neurotransmitters. So from a nervous system perspective, again, really, really core prerequisite need. We have to have a good microflora. So quick review of the three criteria we talked so much about last time. Human strain bacteria, we know that there is a species specific affinity for bacteria in attaching to those attachment sites on the cells of our epithelium. And so as we talked about last time, HMF probiotics have been shown the bacteria in the probiotics to latch up to 8 weeks versus the average dairy strain, which is going to be 1 to 2 weeks max. So this is why we're starting by, we want to know human strain for that maximal attachment and value. Second, we want to see clinical research, human clinical research that shows what can we expect from the strains. And again, quick reminder, we're not looking for research done on species like a Lactobacillus acidophilus and extrapolating. We want to know exactly what strain of Lactobacillus acidophilus has been used and make sure that we're getting the exact same strain in the probiotic formula of our choice. Finally, after we tick those two boxes, then we can look at what kind of CFU count do we want, what's the amount that's optimal for the individual and the delivery method. Again, the kind of top of mind thing here, the myths that we really want to bust is avoiding enteric coating vast majority of the time because the enteric coating products will not start to break down until they get into the higher pH in the small intestine. And as we mentioned, so much of the kind of wide systemic activity we're looking for is in that beginning part of the duodenum, the first 18 inches of the small intestine. And so if it doesn't start to break down until it gets to the small intestine, there's a very good chance that we could miss that really particularly important zone. So those are top of mind things to be thinking about when we're choosing a probiotic. Quick reminder here, guys, just about the physiology. So we know that there's two patterns that tend to occur with the microflora in our gut. One is as we decrease and go deeper into the digestive tract, we see increasing amounts of concentration. So if we're targeting the duodenum, that's where, again, all that gut-brain activity is happening. We don't need very large numbers because the bacteria is very lightly concentrated due to the fast transit time. If we're targeting the large intestine, which we'll speak about a little bit later how we do this, but this is where we do need the bigger CFU counts like the 500 billion CFU or upwards of that if we're trying to shift what's going on here. Typically, we're looking at influencing the large intestine with the use of prebiotics. The small intestine is our probiotics, but again, because we're targeting typically the upper region, we're looking at the lactobacillus heavy formulas. Again, that has to do with oxygen concentration. So lactobacilli are oxygen loving. They thrive in high oxygenated environments, whereas we descend and we see the oxygen start to deplete and become less in concentration. That's where we see the bifidobacteria pick up and become the more dominant form. So those are just things to keep in mind, and we'll speak to that as we go through the slides and look at, the probiotics of choice based on where we're targeting. But again, vast majority of the time, we are targeting for most people the duodenum. So this is just a summary slide of some of the areas of research we looked at in part one with respect to these 4 core strains. So again, these are the 4 core strains we see carried through much of the HMF line. And while no means exhaustive, it just is a quick summary of some of the big areas of research that Dr. Palmer and his team have looked at and where these 4 strains deliver, big physiological benefits. So namely, lots of different ways that they kind of deliver benefit when used alongside an antibiotic. With respect to digestive health, the reduction of IBS symptoms, with cognitive health, a lessening of trait anxiety, as well as an improvement of overall attention and ability to focus. And then with immune health, looking at kind of most specifically the improvement of both duration and intensity of symptoms seen for upper respiratory tract infections and a lessening frequency in children. So those are some of the core areas that are most broadly applicable. So we've talked a lot about the diverse, broad range of physiological benefits that the four core HMF strains have. And that being said, sometimes Dr. Plummer and his team have stumbled across bacteria that have very unique targeted capabilities. And we're going to talk about two of those such bacteria today, the Lactobacillus plantarum, Col66, and Lactobacillus rhamnosus, Col63, which have two very unique, exciting applications. So the first strain we're going to look at is Lactobacillus plantarum Col66 and its ability to help facilitate fat metabolism. So you've seen this Lactobacillus plantarum Col66 before in our HMF fitness, which did have research that showed those taking the combination of the probiotics with the botanicals in the HMF fitness had an increased weight loss versus the controls that were taking the placebo. However, both cohorts in that study were engaged in a calorie reduced diet and increased activity. Here in the Promogen study was a large scale study looking at weight loss. And in this case, there was no changes made to diet or lifestyle. So the only difference, the only intervention was the introduction of 50 billion CFU per day in combination of the Genestra's four core broadly studied strains plus this Lactobacillus plantarum Col66. And what they saw in comparison to the placebo was that the group receiving the probiotics had an increase of weight loss, of decreased BMI, as well as decreased waist circumference. So all three metrics there. And in addition, had a significant improvement to various changes of quality of life. So for general perceived wellness and state of health, their perceived state of energy, of mood, their reported sleep quality, as well there was benefits to the immune factors and similar to what we saw in the immune studies we looked at in part one with improvement with respect to symptoms, less frequency and less duration of upper respiratory tract symptoms, as well even a decrease in reported headaches in the group receiving the HMF probiotics, as well finally, if that all wasn't enough, for those who had elevated levels of cholesterol, there was a decrease in HDL. And so that brings me to also kind of highlight, who would be the kind of core ideal user to be thinking about this, this particular strain, because this Lactobacillus plantarum is showing a unique ability, and the suspected mechanism of action is actually, with respect to the cholesterol, is interacting with the epithelial lining and preventing the reabsorption. So that's a suspected mechanism of action with respect to why it might be reducing the cholesterol. So the HMF metabolic, we see, is definitely something to be thinking about when we're trying to assist in weight management, as well. With the 33 billion of those four core strains, we see that this is significantly over the 25 billion CFU we see in the HMF intensive or the IBS relief. So we can look to this product not only for its metabolic benefits that we saw in the Promogen, but also supporting gastrointestinal health in a very significant way and deriving all of those benefits we talked about in part one. Again, as I've noted, we spoke about the increase in weight loss, the core group that showed the most increase, because there was a variety of BMIs, some people who were considered overweight, and some people whose BMI actually, put them into the category of being considered obese. So actually, the people who were overweight, and actually those with higher elevated levels of cholesterol, they were the participants who lost the most weight in the study. So that type of patient, someone who is overweight and has a fat metabolism issue that could be, being expressed with an increased elevated level of cholesterol, that is an ideal person that we're looking at. Namely, something of interest is, when we look at elevated cholesterol, there is often we can see a picture of uncontrolled chronic stress, and cholesterol being a marker that we see move and elevate in response to stress. I know Dr. Dick Tom was actually speaking about this in a recent seminar, that historically, because sympathetic activity, was often for evolutionarily triggered by times when our physical well-being was threatened, it enacted, different physiological mechanisms that would help promote clotting. So that increase of LDL is just a part of that cascade. So it is to prevent us from, perhaps bleeding out, with, because so much of the physical triggers were what was driving the sympathetic activity of physical threat. So I think that that's a very interesting way of looking at it. And we harken back to that first slide, and we look at the microflora and its ability and involvement in producing the neurotransmitters, we start to see, with this particular product, how physiologically there's multiple organ systems being touched on, addressed, both from the immune cytokine, the production of neurotransmitters that can help to regulate central nervous system activity, and then with this plantarum, looking at potentially a very direct interaction with the epithelium and how that might be influencing cholesterol levels through a prevention of reabsorption. As practitioners, we know food intolerances are an incredibly common issue, and wheat and dairy are two of the primary food groups that we see people struggling with. One of the reasons that people often struggle with these two foods in particular is that they can be very hard to digest. And so if we are unable to properly fully digest a food, it is going to leave us more prone to developing an inappropriate immune response. In the cases of wheat and dairy, when the proteins are left not fully digested, it actually results in the creation of exorphins, which have an opiate-like effect on the brain. And this is why people can often report feeling brain fog, fatigue post eating some of these foods. Now, the Lactobacillus rhamnosus col63 is a unique strain of bacteria that has shown an exceptional ability to break down and help metabolize these undigested wheat and dairy proteins. So it's a great strain to be adding in if someone does report feeling brain fog or fatigue post the consumption of wheat or dairy. In the HMF line, where we find this strain is in the HMF neuro products, and the neuro is actually a nod to that, that brain fog like symptom. And so we see the Lactobacillus rhamnosus both in the capsules as well as the powder form. In the main difference, both have 12 billion CFU per dose, but the main difference is that the capsules have 250 milligrams of glutamine, whereas the powder has 500 milligrams of glutamine per serving, as well as FOS. So we talked about FOS in the first part of the series, it being like the fertilizer. So we think about, our gut like a garden. Back to the concept that most often it's nice to start people on something without FOS to help minimize aggravation. If you're dealing with a weedy garden, you would always want to pull the weeds first and then add the fertilizer when it's just flours. Our gut's the same. We want to get that turnover. So, there's no harm that's going to be done by giving FOS because the affinity and ability to attach of the Genestra strains are so strong, they will bump off those undesirable species, but you just might end up with a little bit extra gas production in the meantime. So there's no harm with starting with a neuro, but if you're concerned about having some of the aggravation and compliance, best to start with the neuro capsules. If someone doesn't want to swallow capsules or it's a child, there's no problem. You can just open the capsule into a bit of juice or food and mix it in, and that works quite well. Okay, switching gears a little bit here, we're going to hone in on looking at moms and infants. And so we have a couple of different things we're going to look at, and we're going to start by looking at a cluster of 4 core strains that have been studied. 2 of these will look familiar. These are 2 of the 4 we talked about through part 1 of the 4 core strains. The 2 lactobacillus strains, however, are different. And so we're just going to look at what is the unique research that Dr. Plummer and his team have done with this cluster of 4 strains. So the first thing that Dr. Plummer and his team did was they ran a clinical trial to establish the safe use of the HMF probiotic strains in infants. And once that was done, they then launched a large-scale clinical study with 454 pregnant women, half of whom received 10 billion CFU of this HMF cluster of probiotics, and the other half received a placebo. At the time of birth, the infants whose moms were given the HMF probiotics, they then began a course of the same HMF probiotics, again at the same dosing, so 10 billion CFU from day 1 of birth up until 6 months of age. And when compared with the baby mother diets who had received the placebos, the babies that had the HMF had a 57% decrease in the incidence of atopic eczema and a 44% decrease in the development of allergies based on skin prick allergy sensitivity testing to, your common allergens like grass, dairy, eggs, pollen, etc., etc. More impressive than even just these 2 numbers, which in of itself is quite impressive, was that when retested at 2 years of age, we saw that these cohorts still held. So the babies, even though they stopped receiving the probiotics at 6 months, 18 months later, they still had significant decrease in atopic eczema as well as development of allergies, really emphasizing that the first 6 months of life are really a unique window in time as the immune system is developing. Also, what is really important too in capturing that window is not just the modulation and development of a healthy immune system, but also the bacteria that an infant is exposed to in the first 6 months to even perhaps 12 months of life, we do know has the ability to lay down and colonize permanently, which is also a massive win, and making this time period really something that we want to seize upon clinically. So these 4 strains that we're talking about, we find them in our HMF maternity, the HMF baby B, and the HMF baby F. So baby B versus baby F is really designed for breastfed babies versus formula-fed babies. And the main difference between the 2 is the amount of prebiotics that they have. So breast milk naturally contains a lot of oligosaccharides. So again, a lot of that kind of rich fiber that's going to feed and nourish the bacteria as it grows and colonizes. Babies who are being formula fed are not necessarily they're not getting those natural oligosaccharides, and so there's added prebiotics in the form of fructooligosaccharides and galactoligosaccharides to help make up for and supplement what they would not be getting by missing the breast milk, and so helps to offset that and really ensure that the bacteria have what they need to optimally colonize and grow and establish robust colonies. The HMF maternity is completely free of any prebiotics. It is just the bacteria. So all 3 of these products are identical when it comes to the bacteria. So it's 10 million in all of them, and it's the same formula makeup, the only difference being the prebiotic. So no prebiotic in the maternity, a little bit of prebiotic in the baby B, and a lot of prebiotic in the baby F for those formula-fed babies. Sometimes, in just back to that idea of starting someone on a formula that is free of prebiotics to begin with, especially if there's a suspicion that they have a really unbalanced microflora that might be contributing to gas and bloating. I've often told moms that if their babies are having digestive issues, they can start them on the maternity and just open up a capsule and use that, because again, it's the exact same formula. And as you can see, all of the formulas are, from a bacterial perspective, are vegan friendly. So that's another consideration here of when you might want to use the maternity, because part of the fiber, the galacto-oligosaccharide, is derived from milk. That makes the baby formulations not vegan friendly. That's another reason that a mom or parent, a father, might want to choose the HMF maternity for their child, is if they're looking for that vegan element. So really exciting news on the baby front. I can't tell you how many times I've been asked, that's amazing when we talk about the research associated with the HMF baby B and baby F, but some parents are just really can't get their head around utilizing a powder with a young infant, and they really want something that is liquid. And so they ask about, is there a liquid option? And we can now finally say, yes, there is, because we have HMF baby drops, which have 1 billion CFU per a 5-drop serving. And what is really exciting about this unique strain that you see here that is different from our baby BBBF, but this particular combination of these two strains has some great clinical trials that have been shown to not only promote favorable gut flora and support digestive health, but also improve the symptoms of colic. So, if you've been around a colicky baby, you know how devastating, it can be both for that, the stress for that child, but also the stress it induces for parents who really find it difficult to bring a sense of relief. And so the HMF baby drops have a wonderful ability to help. They've been shown to clinically help improve colic symptoms. And again, in that really convenient, shelf-stable, to boot, liquid option, which is easy to throw in a diaper bag and be able to, give without much difficulty whatsoever. Now we'll turn to look at some of the specialty combination probiotics that we have within the HMF line, looking at unique formulations that combine not just the probiotics with nutrients, but also in some cases botanicals. So when we're looking to help support the immune system, there are lots of options within the HMF line, as you can see. So all of the options depicted on this slide deliver 1,000 IU of vitamin D, which is great when we're looking at optimizing and balancing immune activity, because as we know, vitamin D being immunomodulatory is going to help support a robust response against potential pathogens, while at the same time reining in any perhaps inappropriate or overactive responses that might be manifesting like towards food or common allergens. So it really helps to balance and optimize. Now, if we look at what are the differences, the HMF Fit for School, the tablets and powder, they deliver 25 billion CFU of the 4 core HMF strains that we saw had that pro-child study associated with them in part 1. The HMF Immune, which comes in a chewable tablet as well as now a shelf-stable option, delivers 25 billion CFU of those 4 core strains, so double the dose, and meets the same levels that we find in the HMF Intensive or the IBS Relief, as a reminder. It also has the addition, though, however, of a 5th strain, and this 5th strain has its own unique clinical study that showed to be effective at helping to minimize the frequency and reduce the duration of upper respiratory tract infection symptoms in active adults. Now, in this study, there was 2 billion CFU used, and you'll find 5 billion in the HMF immune formula, so 2.5 times what was leveraged in the clinical study. Now, the HMF immune powder also delivers, similar to the Fit for School, 12.5 billion CFU of the 4 core strains, so the same strains and makeup that we found in the Fit for School, but also 16 different vitamins and minerals, including that vitamin D. So this is a great option, and this is one I would consider turning to when you're concerned perhaps that someone is not getting the nutrient density that they have in their diet and they need some key support of those immune supportive nutrients like vitamin C, which delivers 1,000 milligrams per sachet, and 5.5 milligrams of zinc, both obviously really important implications for the immune system. When looking to support cognitive health, HMF neurocognition delivers 12.5 billion CFU of the 4 core strains that we spoke about in part 1 so extensively, along with bacopa, lutein, and zeaxanthin. So here we see a great synergistic combination of a trademarked proprietary form of bacopa that has been clinically studied, is shown to support both improvements of attention, ability to really focus, as well as memory. And then lutein and zeaxanthin are great antioxidants that really help to support the eye health and any kind of age-related degeneration that we can see. So two typical people that pop into mind that would be the ideal candidate for the HMF neurocognition. One is the elderly, someone who is concerned that with increasing age that they're worried about a decline in cognitive function, as well as those age-related declines in eyesight that we see so commonly. Second, though, however, is somebody who is perhaps a student or just in general looking for increased cognitive performance, whether it's work-related, and tends to spend a lot of time in front of a screen, right? So a lot of us are spending more time in front of screens these days, and having those antioxidants is a really nice kind of TLC for the eyes and support for that perspective. So again, we can see unique usages both in someone looking to increase performance, but then also the elderly in preserving performance of both brain and ocular health. HMF Digestzyme really provides a solid 1-2 punch for support with respect to the digestive function an individual has, both by helping optimize the microflora with 12.5 billion CFU of those 4 core strains, along with digestive enzyme support. So one of the ways that we see digestion, start to really be hindered is via stress. And we know that stress both impacts our microflora as well as impacts our body's ability to produce stomach acid and digestive enzymes required for breaking down our food efficiently. So in sympathetic overdrive, those parasympathetic activities of digestion are going to be compromised, and that can really set off a domino effect. And so again, when we're trying to streamline a protocol, a lot of times patients and clients can get overwhelmed being put on too many things, although they might need support in numerous facets. And so this is a great product that combines 2 core digestive needs that we see so frequently, especially in the context of stress, into one easy to take capsule. HMF Intensive 500. So this is the bringing out of the big guns. When is this indicated? So as you can see here, what is most obvious is the high numbers. And if we remember back to the pattern of colonization, we need these larger numbers when we are targeting the large intestine. And as we see, this is a formula that is directed towards supporting the large intestine. We should not be surprised to see that there is an increased focus with a higher ratio of bifidobacterium. So of the 500, 300 billion CFU are bifidobacterium, which are the dominant species in the large intestine, but we still have a huge amount of coverage with 200 billion lactobacillus. So the duodenum is more than well being served. The intensive 500, where I look to this, the kind of patient client picture where I've seen this work in, my practice was looking at individuals that had skin conditions. So individuals that had, so let's say eczema, psoriasis, these are very inflammatory conditions that typically have large intestinal involvement. Also, patients that have, conditions like Crohn's or colitis, we are definitely, assuming that there is dysfunction and disrupted, unbalanced microflora throughout the entirety of the gastrointestinal tract. So for any of those cases, we want to ensure that we're focusing on restoring the flora throughout the entire digestive system. So when we want to touch the flora and balance in the large intestine, this is where we need big numbers. So intensive 500 is geared towards addressing the entirety of the digestive tract. Now, I will say that in acute modes, I have myself and numerous other practitioners recommended 2, 3, 4 sachets a day when someone is, in an acute need, and then titrating back down to a sachet a day, and then even weaning off to half a sachet a day, and maybe getting down eventually back to something like the HMF intensive 25 million. Shifting gears and looking at options to protect the urinary tract, we've got a couple here that are well suited for acute incidents of urinary discomfort, often linked to a UTI. One being the HMF UTI itself, which has 15 million CFU and 12.5 grams of fresh fruit equivalent, and the HMF cystogen, which has a slightly lower dose of probiotic with a 10 billion, but an increased content of cranberry, as well as the addition of vitamin C and some potassium. So the presence of the vitamin C and the potassium is really, in the context of an infection, helping to create a more acidic stream, as well as obviously the cranberry that you find in both formulas is really targeted at creating an anti-adhesive effect. So pathogens such as E. coli are able to attach to the lining of the urethra and ascend up into the bladder, and then, in worst case scenarios, further up into the kidneys because of their ability to attach. So cranberry interrupts that ability and can be quite effective for helping facilitate the body flushing out of those pathogens. Couple of options for maintenance dosing in the HMF Women's Daily. So we have the original HMF Women's Daily in capsule form. We now have the new capsule form with respect to shelf-stable option, as well as the Women's Daily chewables. Now the chewables I will warn are a little bit, tart, but those of us that like sour. But also the benefit of why you might consider a chewable, whether it's in the Women's Daily formula or the HMF Immune, is that we do give the bacteria a chance to colonize in the oral pharyngeal cavity, right? And so one of the ways that bacteria help protect us is they adhere to the lining and compete with undesirable flora for nutrients and space, as well as promoting, antimicrobial compounds and optimizing the pH for our friendly flora. So they do this in the gut, which we obviously talk about a lot. They also do this, again, in the oral nasal pharyngeal cavity when they have a chance to colonize there, as well as the vaginal canal. And so we see with the Women's Daily, there's a few additions beyond the Genesta 4-core strains. We have the Lactobacillus gastri, which we saw in the previous formulas, but also the addition of this Lactobacillus acidophilus strain and another Lactobacillus rhamnosus, both of which have great clinical research for helping maintain a healthy vaginal flora. So this is a nice combination product where we're getting a host, a variety of bacteria with clinically proven abilities to support both urinary tract and vaginal health, along with the cranberry. So a nice kind of blanket coverage for women's health with respect to both UTIs, prevention, and vaginal floral optimization. So when we optimize the flora of our digestive tract, we will optimize the flora of our vaginal health because there's a translocation and migration of the bacteria from our gut to the vaginal canal. So the vaginal canal is going to reflect what is in our gut largely. That being said, there's often cases where we want to further support the vaginal health, maybe acutely, in the case of perhaps recurring yeast infections for women that maybe experience them in general, or particularly maybe become susceptible post antibiotic use, or just any other condition or environment where we know that the vaginal flora has been threatened or disrupted. And so for those cases, we now have, excited to announce, the HMF Vaginal Health Suppositories. So these give a very direct boost to the system and help to, displace the undesirable vaginal flora and replace it with an optimal form of Lactobacillus plantarum that will help to attach to the epithelial, outcompete some of the undesirable, but also once colonizing and producing lactic acid will help to stabilize the pH of the vagina, making it more optimal for the growth of, our friendly bacteria and less habitable for the unwanted microorganisms. So what else is new with HMF? We talked about a few new formulations, but we're going to take a look at the full line of the shelf-stable formulations as well as some updated labels that you'll be seeing. So here on this slide, you'll see some of our new shelf-stable formulas, and they'll probably look familiar though because they are all based on our same clinically researched formulas that are some of our best-selling and, go-to for condition specific. But now, in addition to the classic refrigerated version, we have a shelf-stable option as well. And the only one that we did not really talk about in part one or part two here is the HMF multi-strain. And one of the ways that many people like to use the HMF multi-strain is to kind of throw in every once in a while throughout their rotation of their favorite probiotic, just to kind of mix things up, throw a little different strains in there and kind of break up the routine. I often encourage people that, find the probiotic that works for you, stick with it, but you can also change it seasonally, kind of upping maybe from the forte to something like the intensive through cold and flu season. That's a recommendation, or to something like the immune. I make a lot of times, but other people really like to kind of throw in a little bit extra variety. And if that's the case, the multi-strain is a great way to do that. Here you'll just see this is a complete list of all of the shelf-stable offerings. So the original formulas that we have had for quite a while, the new shelf-stable release of some of our favorite refrigerators that we just spoke to in the previous slide, and then of course the new exciting delivery systems of the baby drop and liquid formula, as well as the vaginal suppositories. So that's the complete list of what's available that does not need refrigeration. But quickly, because it's a question I hear all the time, just clarifying, what is the difference between a refrigerated and a shelf-stable product? And the bacteria in that the product contains is the exact same. The manufacturing process is the exact same. The only difference is that the shelf-stable products have an increased overage of bacteria. So what that means is that for all of our HMF line, there is more bacteria put in at the time of manufacturing than what is listed on a label. So what you see on the label is the amount of CFUs, colony forming units, that we are guaranteeing are going to be there at the date of expiry. So at the time of production, these shelf-stable formulas have an increased amount of bacteria put in, and they typically have a little bit of a shorter life from time manufacturing to expiry. So let's say the average product is approximately 2 years. These might be more like 18 months or so. So that's the main difference. So same bacteria, same formulas, same, backed by clinical research, just an increased overage and, slight difference in shelf life and expiry. Okay, let's talk about what's new with the HMF labels. So as we see down here under the non-medicinal ingredients, we're going to see ingredients used to maintain viability of probiotics. These are also referred to as stabilizers, and stabilizers are absolutely necessary and integral to ensuring that bacteria through the manufacturing process are preserved, and once they arrive in the digestive system are kept integral and can reactivate and become effective. So let's just talk a little bit more about how they work and the purpose they serve. So the two ways that the stabilizers help to protect and preserve the bacteria is one, through the freezing process. They help to reduce the formation of ice crystals, which can damage the bacteria. And secondly, during the drying process, which is really important in the preservation, helping to put the bacteria in a somewhat like dormant state. As the water is driven out, it needs to be replaced with something in order to protect that 3D structure of the proteins in the bacteria. And so these salt, sugars, and amino acids help to replace the water molecules and again preserve that structure. Once then in our gut and exposed to the moisture levels there, the water molecules then kind of redisplace those stabilizers, and in doing so help to reactivate the bacteria, allowing it to then attach, colonize, and yield all the benefits we've talked about so much today. Now, obviously, as soon as we say the word sugar, the next question is obviously going to be how much sugar are we talking about? And it is very, very minimal. And as you can see here, it's actually in the vast majority of the formulas is equivalent to as little as a third of a blueberry. And in some formulas like the HMF Forte, even less than that, being more equivalent to about a sixth of a blueberry. So really, really minimal and consequential sugar levels. Okay, quick summary slide of some of the points that we hope have been ingrained in your brains at this point. Obviously, we talked a lot about probiotics alongside a fiber-rich diet, offering so many health benefits and really helping, individuals understand the different and synergistic effects of the probiotics and the prebiotics. And, the fact that it's really important that we hammer home to our patients and clients that, the benefits they can expect are really tied to the strains and making sure that the strains that we're recommending are clinically backed. But beyond all that, after we choose probiotics, looking for those key factors of human specific and, clinical backing, we always want to make sure that we don't forget some of the things that really matter in the how of taking the probiotics that are important that often we can take for granted because they're second nature, and making sure that we're always including in our recommendations of not just what to take, but hammering home the hows, and ideally emphasizing the benefits of taking with food to maximize the attachment in the upper region of the small intestine, specifically that duodenal region that we see all of the kind of hotspot for gut brain and immune, as well as in the enteric hormonal activity. 2 to 3 hours away from antibiotics. We've talked a lot about the huge benefits that can be, achieved when taking with a course of antibiotics alongside that antibiotic, but we do need to make sure they understand to take 2 to 3 hours away so as not to eradicate with the antibiotic. And finally, and this one is huge, aggravations of symptoms means the product is indicated and working. It's the die-off of the undesirable bacteria that's causing the gas, the bloating, the change in stool, or, other kind of key symptoms that we can see. So really empowering the end user with that knowledge so that they understand they are not having an adverse reaction, but it is in fact an aggravation that shows that they need it and it's working, and then helping them to navigate and manage just by dialing back and slowing down, reducing dosage. All of these are ways that we can help adjust to minimize that aggravation, but just making sure that there's literacy, body literacy, and understanding what is going on. And finally, we're just wrapping up again with a summary of the key outcomes from the clinical trials that we've talked about throughout part one and part two here, namely benefits for usage alongside antibiotics, benefits to those who have IBS, some of the cognitive benefits we see due to the gut-brain connection, and then, of course, the Primogen metabolic study, which had a host of different improvements, not just in weight, but also in other immune function and other key quality of life indicators. ProChild, which is our kind of classic immune, and then the Swansea Baby clinical trials, which really show, again, highlight that kind of unique beginning of life window that we have to really set and modulate healthy immune function. Thank you so much for your time listening to this two-part series. I hope that it has got you not only excited about HMF and all the clinical backing that you can find in these products, but also feeling confident about how to navigate the line and make solid recommendations that will bring great outcomes for your patients and clients.